Hi, my name is Steve Mulberry, and I want to share some strategies and lessons we've learned from helping our customers and organizations adopt the utility network, specifically for water systems. Now, why listen to GISinc? Why listen to me? We've been strategically aligned with Esri and the ArcGIS platform for over 29 years now. We have around 130 passionate professionals with one core purpose, and that's to help our customers and organizations fully leverage their GIS investment to gain better insights through location-based technology. And not only are we a platinum business partner with Esri, but we're also a platinum business partner with CityWorks. And bringing these two platforms together makes it really nice for us to help our organizations implement a best of breed in the GIS space, as well as asset management and work order management systems. Also, I like to point out that Esri requires its business partners to become specialty designated in certain areas like Release Ready or ArcGIS Indoors or Hub or other solutions that they provide. And one of the ones that we hold dear to our heart is Utility Network Management Specialty Designation, specifically for the water systems. We have a team of folks on site here at GISinc that have worked very closely with some of our customers to help them migrate and move over to the utility network. And I want to talk through some of those examples and samples that we've been through. And I'm going to do that sort of in three categories here. I want to kind of talk to you through the lessons learned that we've done by sharing with you what you need to know, some things to get started, what benefits that you receive once you implement the utility network, and then I guess most importantly, what you need to do to get started. What are some things you can do right now and over the long run to help prepare yourself for implementing the utility network? So let's get started here and let's talk about what you need to know. And I want to start off with the platform, the Water Solution Foundation. And on one side of the fence here, we've got the enterprise approach using Utility Network Foundation. This is implementing things like ArcGIS Enterprise, using ArcGIS Desktop Pro for all your data management, and utilizing the utility network management tools and extensions. So you deploy using ArcGIS Enterprise, you get client managed environment, highly customizable, the ability to have multiple editors through versioning. You may have heard a term branch versioning. We'll talk about that some. Localized data schema, and we see this as fitting that mid to large size utility. So this is the enterprise approach. Well, on the other side, there's this concept of a simple hosted services using the Water Distribution System Foundation, where organizations can have a jump start or get started with a very light footprint and still take advantage of what the utility network has to offer. You need to have ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Desktop to get started. This is for sort of small organizations that can get up and running very fast. Literally in a few minutes, you can deploy the solution to ArcGIS Online. It is a simple features-only environment. So there's no extended network capabilities, no versioning, right? No multiple editors hitting the database. You still get to use ArcGIS Pro for that precision editing and topology requirements there. And there's also a file geodatabase option. And before I move on, I want to kind of show you what that looks like. So if you were in ArcGIS Pro, just like you would to go to deploy any other solution template, you can deploy the Water Distribution Foundation solution template. And what that looks like, and let me bring this over here to the screen, is it builds a folder structure in ArcGIS Online and all of the feature services, the web maps and applications that make up this foundation of simple hosted features. And it builds things like a web map for you. So here's an example of the web map looking at the different features. Now you don't have to use all these features to get up and running. You can again sort of slowly move into this new environment and leverage what's available to you and start editing the information that you want to kind of play around with. And here's an example of doing such as that. And so here's a web map with some basic features in here, and I can identify and start to edit and maintain this information. Again, using ArcGIS Pro, but publishing to ArcGIS Online. Now, why is that possible? And we're going to talk about this more as we go through the presentation, but it's all about service-oriented architecture, where ArcGIS Pro can consume REST endpoints. And then finally, there's applications that are automatically deployed for you that allow you to disseminate that information through a web experience. So let's go back to the PowerPoint here and let's finish up. So there's two options, the enterprise approach or the simple hosted services approach. And we at GISinc can provide jump starts on either platform. So if you need help getting started in the enterprise space or the simple hosted feature space, we can help get you started. So what is required? Let's look at the enterprise side here a little bit closer. We talked about the need for ArcGIS Pro, 2.4 or higher, standard or advanced, in the utility network add-in tools. You also need ArcGIS Enterprise, again, standard or advanced. Now we recommend starting at least at 10.7.1. We know it's supported at 10.6.1, but we found a better integration point at 10.7.1. You still need to have ArcGIS Server, and it must be federated with Portal. There's a UN licensing requirement. And prior to 10.8, there was a UN extension that needed to be deployed at ArcGIS Enterprise in order to handle the licensing. But we're going to talk about a new user type extension that Esri released at 10.8 that helps simplify that process. And then obviously you also need an enterprise geodatabase, and you can see what Esri supports here across the board. Now what's interesting is that this platform has been around for a long time. These configuration components here, ArcGIS Pro has been around for 5 years, and Enterprise has been around for a decade, and the geodatabase has been around for even longer than that. And the Water Distribution Network Foundation is at at version 3.4. So this is a very solid platform, and you can be confident in knowing that you're deploying a very trusted and tried solution. So let's talk about the user type extension. Basically, Esri is making this a little more simpler for helping to extend what users can do by providing access to very specific functionality that can be used right inside the compatible applications like desktop, mobile, and web, all through the REST endpoint. And that's key here. So starting at 10.8, Esri released the Utility Network Services user type extension, and you may have heard that the Parcel Fabric also follows the same licensing model. So what does this really mean? It means that the REST endpoint is where the security is enforced. So if you look at a typical deployment of the utility network, you get 5 services. You get a feature service, you get a map service, you get the network diagram, utility network services, and then you get the version management service. What's highlighted here in the orange area here is what's enforced by the user type extension. This is what is required to have a license, which means that those other 3 services are wide open. Again, all at the REST endpoint. So if you look at the user types across the board, right, we have from the viewer to editor all the way up to insights and storyteller, which was recently introduced at 10.8. But if you just want to view and query and look at the information that's being used inside the utility network services, then everybody has access to that capability. It's only when you want to get access to those 2 services for extended capabilities do you have to have that new user type add-on enforcement. And you can see here from the levels of user types, if you're at the GIS professional level, standard or advanced, it's just baked into the licensing. So remember, everybody can view a query, but to get access to those extended capabilities, you have to then implement the user type extension, and all that's done right inside of ArcGIS Online. Just like you can assign and enable and disable licensing, you do the user types there as well. So let's move on to the benefits. What do you receive by implementing the utility network? We're going to kind of go through a couple areas here. And the first one I want to talk about is field mobility. Right, the ability to be connected or disconnected and have that connectivity be maintained across native applications that are iOS and Android supported, web-based applications, both serving the outdoor space as well as the indoor space. There's also this cross-platform integration component that means that I can have any device, anywhere, anytime. I can be on a desktop, I can be in a tablet, I can be on a smartphone, out in the field doing field mobility. I can also have access to high-end geoprocessing tools. Because remember, it all falls into this modernized architecture, which means it's a service-oriented architecture. Everything is REST-based services, which makes it convenient and easy to integrate across any device anywhere. So mobile, desktop, tablet, geoprocessing services all are accessed via this services-oriented architecture. We also get the use of ArcGIS Pro, which is a 64-bit application. ArcGIS Enterprise with state-of-the-art back-end tools for publishing and servicing the information. We also get improved asset representation. So we get this concept of a high fidelity data model, allowing us to explicitly define that connectivity or asset directionality, or create terminals. And Esri has introduced these concepts of containments and associations for allowing us to gather information together and organize our devices and manage these devices at the device level, not at a group level. And it's a platform to allow us to move into the future. So this is something that Esri just didn't start working on. This has been years in the making. And so Esri is making it easier for us to not make bad data. So they're giving us the tools and the platforms to help us manage this information across the board, in 2D and in 3D, and vertical assets as well. So lots of benefits that we can leverage right from the utility network once we start deploying that. So what do you need to do? Well, what do you need to do to get started? And this can take multiple forms, and we know that there's not one size fits all, but we have found that over our experience with helping customers implement the utility network, we've come up with this sort of process here. And it all begins with the readiness assessment. We think that's the key here. The data cleansing and platform implementation and these other processes can take an evolving approach, but having a really nice ready assessment can really help mitigate the risk by migrating to the utility network. So I want to focus in on that readiness assessment here for a second. And so any migration to the UN requires very thoughtful planning and preparation. One thing I want to highlight here too is that I think this is the point in which you should develop a UN working group. This is folks in your organization that meet regularly and talk about the readiness assessment and talk about these processes and work together and educate and help move this process forward. And this process might look like this. So we start off with planning, right? Having a planning meeting and ensuring that we cover all the topics and it may be things that are high importance to your team, but we organize that information in a thoughtful process. We look at the infrastructure and review what's required and what roles and what part of the enterprise that we need to deploy if we don't have that in place now. We look at staffing and see what might have to change, or what kind of training do we have to offer to make sure that we have the right folks in place to support this new environment. We look at our data and review what we have now and how that's going to impact our migration process. We're going to use and talk about some tools to help with that process. We want to make sure that we go over this, look at the crosswalking efforts that are going to be required to get our data in place here. We look at the editing workflows and review the changes that are going to take place moving from what we're doing before, this non-UN world, to what it's going to look like in the UN space. And then we look at desktop requirements. What's going to be needed in order to make this work? And we know that ArcGIS Pro is going to be the data management components. We want to make sure that we have the training in place and folks are starting to migrate off of ArcMap. And then finally, executing, right? Taking that roadmap and that plan and then putting it into place. And what does that plan look like? We kind of go around the horn here, where we start off with the data cleansing side of this. We look at all the information, we look at the required attributes. We're going to use tools like the data reviewer. If you're not familiar with that, This is one of the desktop tools that you get very familiar with as you go through this process. And we'll work through those source errors one at a time. And we don't have to be completely finished with this process before we move on to the next steps, but we have to have this data cleansing process under wraps. We have to make sure we can control this process and understand what's happening here. We move on to platform implementation. So we look at tools that might help us support this migration process. We have teamed up with SSP, which makes a really nice tool called GISinc to help us keep two environments up to date simultaneously, so we can have our old platform in place while we're building out the new one and keep the information flowing. We're going to look at tools like the data loading tools. We're going to deploy a development environment. We're going to make sure we have the right resources in place, because the utility network is very resource intensive. So we want to make sure we have ArcGIS Enterprise in there. And we talked about the versions. We want to make sure we have Pro in place. We want to make sure we're utilizing the right enforcement mechanisms, the licensing, the user type extensions, right? And we want to make sure that we're accounting for things that might be a little bit of challenge. Right now, Collector is one of those tools, but we know Esri is hard at work at the new ArcGIS field maps, which is going to leapfrog us into the next evolution of field mapping and access to information through that tool. Next, we're going to talk about migration planning. So we're going to test and correct and get our user feedback. We're going to develop our crosswalks and manage our process for mapping that information. We're going to continue the use of our development environment. We're going to use best patterns for sharing information. We're going to introduce users to the This is where the process where we're going to start to get people and get their hands on this environment, right, through Pro, and all again using the development environment, not moving to production yet, but planning for that editing cutover time. At some point in time, we're going to move from dev to production, and we're going to communicate this process again through our UN working group. We might need some training. We might need some workshops. We might need some discussions and some user forums to make this happen. We want to make sure that that process stays in place there, and our working group is key to that. We're going to move into the integration planning at that point. We're going to ensure that all integration concerns have been addressed. We're going to use our working group to validate that. We should have already tested out ArcGIS Pro. We've looked at our branch versioning. We've done some editing in the utility network field. We're familiar with that space. We've deployed our web applications. We've tested those out. We've looked at any third-party documentation or other solutions that need to be tested, again, in the development space here, which then moves us to the implementation. This is that phase where we move from testing is over. Now it's time to get into moving over to production. So we set up our schedule for freezing those edits so that we can move from one platform to the other. We begin the editing through desktop at that point. No more ArcMap. We are now in ArcGIS Pro. Right? We establish those connections and those versions. We repoint all of our web maps and applications, if needed, from dev to production, following the steps taken during the testing phase. We look at any remaining errors and cleaning that needs to take place. Again, we didn't have to have a fully completed editing database schema before we made this final change, but we have to make sure we understand where these errors need to be fixed in final testing there. And then we kind of follow with education, and I left this at the last bullet point here, but this should go throughout the process, right? We should always, at every stage here, we should be educating, and we should be outreaching, and we should be helping folks understand this process, because this can be scary. Change is scary across the board, especially when you make a big leap like this. And so we want to use that working group to maintain that continuity throughout this whole process. We want to continue that education and outreach, and we want to look for opportunities to help get training to those staff, help them along this process, encourage them to take training, provide that training, provide assistance and help and support along this process. So let's kind of review these topics. So we talked about what you needed to know. We looked at platform requirements, licensing, and accessing that new user type extension. We looked at a lot of the benefits that you receive from field mobility to cross-platform integration to the future of the utility networks. And then we focused in on what you need to do. The readiness assessment is the key here, bookended by the continuous education and outreach all along the way while you perform your platform implementation, your data cleansing, your migration and integration planning, and then your final move over to production. So I want to kind of close up with this one last slide here that kind of talks about asking the right questions. So things that you can ask yourself right now. Do you have ArcGIS Enterprise? Remember, the utility network is a service-based architecture and requires ArcGIS Enterprise. Now the file geodatabase is supported now, and remember we talked about that sort of simple hosted services approach where you can get started, you can get your feet wet, you can dive into the network and get familiar with the platform. But Enterprise is where you'll need to be to implement it across your organization. Do I have a standardized data model? Right, this truly affects the migration strategy and how long this will take. You know, the number of customers and connections and the size of your systems. How many systems do you have? Things like that. Do I use ArcGIS Pro now? This is probably one of those big ones. If you don't, start that migration. Start getting yourself familiar with ArcGIS Pro and the tools and the navigation and working throughout the platform, how to connect information and data and services and things like that. Because you will need to be ready with Pro when you make that final migration step. And do you have any third-party tools leveraging this non-existing UN network? So do you have any asset management systems or a billing system or SCADA or others that might be broken if you move to the utility network without those business system integrations? So make sure you didn't leave anything behind. Again, that readiness assessment should have identified those, but make sure you don't miss that step. And then finally, do you need any help? We've been around for a number of years getting our feet wet. We have a team that's been working with Esri's utility network team from the very beginning. We've deployed this, we've scraped our knees, we know what it takes, and we have a really strong partner in SSP, and together we can help you get to your end goal there. So I want to thank you for listening to me. If you have any questions at all, please email me at steve.mulberry@gisinc.com. And remember, when you go to deploy this, look for that utility network management specialty designation and make sure whoever you use has that ready, because that'll ensure your success. Thank you.